Good to go?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Alright guys, well thank you so much for coming. I was actually a little bit concerned when I saw the program and saw the multi-generations of gifted adults, and I was like, I would go to that one. That one looks awesome, but you know, because you're here, hopefully it's resonating with those of you who are going along the same path and have been touched by the theory of positive disintegration and are seeing the need for this ideal spiritual element. And so I'm a little bit nervous to give this more than I normally am. I kind of like giving presentations, but this one is deeply personal to me. I'm going to be sharing some personal experiences, and so that kind of adds that overexcitability of anxiety that maybe I might be rejected, but then there's that level 4 of I don't really care. So, so I'll get started. I'll start off with talking about something that I don't really talk with much people about, but I feel like it's something that we can all relate to. At least we can remember it. But I remember when I was a child, my brother needed something, and I remember helping him, and I remember this warm feeling coming into my heart, and it felt really good. And I was told that this was the Holy Ghost, and that this Holy Ghost would be with me my entire life when I made choices that were positive and good, and that it would teach me truth. And I remember having experiences as I got older, especially when I did things that were more me, when I was living and doing things that I knew that I was uniquely able to do. And when I did things that were less me, I remember feeling that presence go away. And so I don't know how to talk about it in terms of, you know, putting it in a religious context, but I think that's something that we all feel as children, and we all know that warmth that comes into us when we are doing positive things of light. So now I'm going to flash forward several years and talk about the beginning of my disintegration experience. So I began working at a company, and I had just graduated from college. I was in an MBA program. I had basically done everything I'd wanted to do in life, and I started to question when I began researching about the theory of positive disintegration. And I got to a point where we had just bought a house, and I was laid off from my job, and so I had a lot of time to think, and I was in about 4 months of solitude. This was after a pretty significant breakdown, and I remember struggling with thoughts of, would it be the ethical thing for me to do to take my life? Because it seems like I just can't seem to fit in with society and with the world. And my wife was pregnant, and we had our first baby on the way, and I thought, how can I possibly provide for a family? Would it be the ethical thing for me to do to leave this world? And not to mention that everything in my life had kind of been this really disappointing. College was really disappointing for me. Work, I thought getting a job and having a real paycheck and, having a house, that, when I had all these things, that this would kind of be this fullness of life experience. But to have it be so disappointing, it really kind of just, it was this very powerful retrospective experience. What happened next, I remember as soon as he came out of the water, seeing elements of me like his ears. He had my ears, and it just changed me instantly. I just knew there was something that happened inside of me where this was finally the one experience that was not disappointing, and as I had my second one, we just welcomed our second one a couple months ago into our lives. It was a completely different experience, but it again reaffirmed this sense that whatever I had just experienced was part of something bigger, and something that had to do with the complete human experience. So, as I move on, I want to talk about kind of what we're going to cover today. We're going to first start off with following this birth experience. I became very interested in what it means to be human. And so I took a year to really observe and try to do my best without making judgments, but just observe the human as a species, like as if I was an alien coming to Earth, trying to observe humans. And so I'm going to outline my observations of what it means to be human. Second, I'm going to explore a spiritual family tree that contributes to the Dabrowski theory and gives insight to level 5 development. Third, I'm going to explore the Jungian archetype of the self, and Jungian personality functions in relation to Dabrowski's personality ideal. And finally, I'm going to examine the idealistic fullness of joy in relation to divine laws as experienced through pair bonds, marriage, and procreation. So you're going to have to bear with me because this is a lot of information. I'm just going to go through it, and then I'll summarize. So the advancement of humans have proven to be the most evolutionarily and advantaged than any other species on Earth. This evolutional success is mainly attributed to a relatively larger brain with particularly well-developed neocortex, prefrontal cortex, and temporal lobes. The temporal lobes, which contain centers for language processing, have increased disproportionately, as has the prefrontal cortex, which has been related to the complex decision-making and moderating social behavior. These advanced brain functions enable high levels of abstract reasoning, language, problem-solving, sociality, and culture through social learning. Humans are the only beings that are capable of comprehending opposites in relation to the self. This concept will be a matter of emphasis throughout this work, and one will see a common theme of comparing these seemingly paradoxical, counterintuitive opposites that make up the complex human being. Humans are unique in their capacity to create and utilize systems of symbolic communication for self-expression and the exchange of ideas and organizing into purposeful groups. Humans create complex social structures composed of many cooperating and competing groups, from families and kinship networks to political states. Social interactions between humans have established an extremely wide variety of values, social norms, and rituals. These things combined form the basis of human society. Curiosity and the human desire to understand and influence the environment and to explain and manipulate phenomena has provided the foundation for developing various fields of knowledge such as science, philosophy, mythology, religion, anthropology, and psychology. The evolutionary increase in development of the temporal lobes and prefrontal cortex have been attributed to the human ability to develop cooking skills with the capacity to understand proper nutrition and dieting for optimal human functioning. In response to this increase in nutrition, human intelligence has increased as a response to an increased necessity for solving social problems as human society became more complex. Humans retain a degree of sexual dimorphism in the distribution of body hair and subcutaneous fat, and in the overall size, males being 25% larger than females. These changes taken together have been interpreted as a result for increased emphasis on pair bonding as a possible solution to the requirement for increased parental investment due to the prolonged infancy of offspring. A pair bond is the strong affinity that develops in unique species between a male and female. This leads to the potential of producing offspring and/or a lifelong bond. Pair bonds are created by a combination of social interaction and biological factors, including neurotransmitters like oxytocin, vasopressin, and dopamine. Marriage enables both social and sexual pair bonding. There is some debate as to the evolutionary advancement in pair bonds in relation to homosexual and heterosexual pair bonding. Some claim that pair bonds can be experienced to their full extent between homosexuals, while others claim that procreation within a committed marriage is the advanced and fullest form of the human bond. Pair bonding in humans helps explain extreme bonds that we may share with others, but are unable to articulate in terms of comprehending contemporary love. Human beings are unique in that females frequently mate with other males, and other males are in constant competition to earn their privilege to pass on their genes. Monogamy within human society is mostly unique. Procreation leads to the development of a family unit, enabling family bonds. Humans value family in the highest regard, and this value is universal across human cultures. Humans share similarities with animals in their capacity to experience emotions. However, humans are different and advanced in the range and complexity of their emotions. Humans and animals both share similar survival emotions, such as those emotions resulting from fear and hunger, and these can be considered lower emotions. The primary use of emotions is for motivation. When animals or humans are in an emotional state, they are motivated. Humans are unique in their ability to experience higher, more advanced emotions, most specifically the emotion of joy. Humans share the same primitive emotions of fear as animals when survival is threatened. The fear that controls human behavior in society is mostly learned. As social creatures, humans have a fear of isolation and rejection. The limbic system produces an awareness of one's actions in relation to this fear. The limbic system controls our most deep-seated emotions and connects two parts of the brain together, the midbrain and forebrain. The forebrain is responsible for processing information and has evolved significantly in humankind. Within the forebrain is the cerebral cortex, which 95% of its functioning is responsible for associated mental activities like contemplation and planning, and only 5% for processing motor and sensory information. By comparison, a mouse, considered a higher vertebrate, has a cerebral cortex with only 5% of its neurons devoted to associated functions and 95% to motor and sensory functions. The highly developed limbic system is at the core of what it means to be human. We differ from other animals in the amount of time we spend planning, contemplating, and expressing ourselves. It is very powerful. It can override primitive emotions and suppress deep desires. Anyone who has ever seen a sad movie with friends and willfully held back tears because they didn't want their friends to see them crying employed the power of their limbic system. They contemplated the repercussions of their friend's reaction to crying and shut off the emotional cascade that would have brought the tears. Fear is centered in the same neurons of the limbic system. Fear is usually manifested in rational behavior based on irrational thoughts, and it can freeze the processing power of the cerebral cortex. Humans are unique in that they have the capacity to recognize and control their limbic system. To overcome fear, one needs to be in touch with their limbic system and recognize when it is suppressing the obvious. There are roughly 80,000 genes in the human genome, and over 7 billion people carry that genetic component. The chances of two people carrying the same genome are practically impossible. Every human is incredibly unique. Despite this uniqueness, the limbic system is aware of how expressions of individuality may cause social isolation or rejection. Etiquette and being nice are forms of limbic system repression, necessary at times but ultimately demeaning of human originality. Lying is the ultimate form of the limbic system repression. Truth tellers, those who are authentic and trustworthy, have learned to master their limbic system. Liars are slaves to their limbic system, out of touch with their most basic mental capacities. leading to behavior that is guarded and shifty as a response to hiding fear. The human need to identify and develop a personal sense of morality is incredibly important in development. Joy is an emotion experienced as a result of conscious choices that typically involve sacrifice, charity, virtue, triumph, creation, and progress. Joy cannot exist without being conscious of the possibility of pain. Therefore, the attainment of joy is characterized by the possibility of failure, pain, disappointment, or sorrow. Joy is considered to be the highest degree of the human emotion of happiness, and is also distinct from pleasure, which can be attained without sacrifice or other forms of risk. Joy is the ultimate and highest emotional form of human motivation. Joy is the ultimate sensation of well-being. It comes from being in harmony with physical, mental, and spiritual laws, and results in feelings of completeness. Joy is the emotion which accompanies fulfilling the measure of our creation as human beings. Dabrowski said, "Lack of equilibrium in the internal environment affords us an increasingly greater joy as a result of attainments, and a state of depression and the feeling of inferiority when one experiences failures." There is no universally agreed upon definition of what the human mind is or what its distinguishing properties are. Whatever its nature, the capabilities of the human mind are the most advanced of any living creature on earth, and research shows that these capabilities are advancing and evolving. The limitations of what the human mind is capable of is unknown, but it is generally agreed that humans have yet to realize its full potential. Consciousness is the active form of the human mind and is aware of the present moment and is used to make judgments and is associated with logical thinking and analyzing. The capacity and degree for humans to individualize themselves from others is unique to their species. The subconscious and unconsciousness are the passive forms of the human mind and are subjected to the inputs of the environment. It is classified as a perceiving consciousness that responds primarily to the activity of the conscious mind. Human consciousness is typically active during the day and sleeps at night, where the consciousness goes into the body, and the body communicates back to the consciousness the memories, perceptions, and inputs accumulated during active waking consciousness. Consciousness as a research topic has been avoided by the majority of mainstream scientists due to its phenomenal and subjective nature. Recently, what's that?
They can't understand it, that's why it's a challenge.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, we'll get to that. However, the subject of consciousness has been the topic of intense inquiry, especially with the rise of technology. There are many perspectives of how to define the human mind, from philosophy and psychology to rational science. With the modern rise of positivism and rationalism, perspectives that could not be measured by hard science were viewed as inferior. However, as the fundamental gaps in knowledge continue to remain a mystery, an increasing number of scholars are returning to the philosophical and spiritual perspectives to better understand human consciousness. I argue that to be able to advance in the knowledge of the human mind and understand its potential, we must begin looking at wholes and integrating all forms of knowledge by respecting both the measurable and unmeasurable perspectives. Most importantly, we must reevaluate the spiritual perspective with a determination to find ways to measure the unmeasurable. We understand that for the human being to function properly, it must cooperate with certain laws. As an example, for the body to function, it must gain adequate nutrients, hydration, sleep, etc. Science and technology have enabled us to understand the human body and mind better than ever before. However, understanding the laws of the body and the mind must be explored together, seeking an understanding of the human spirit and what laws the spirit must submit to. For this work, I represent laws with limits and boundaries. The perspective that human essence is divine and that we can become like the divine is the ultimate concept of idealism. For this work, I represent this idealism as the possibility of expansion that is impossible without limits or laws. The belief in and the interpretation of these ideals are the principal reason for divergence between notable scholars such as Dabrowski and Maslow, as well as Freud and Jung.
Slow down, go back and read the middle one again.
For this work, I represent this idealism as the possibility of expansion that is impossible without limits or laws.
Okay, so we'll need to talk about that a little bit in coming up.
Okay.
Okay.
So we look at Jung and Freud. Jung was definitely more idealistic and positive about human potential. And whereas Freud viewed human progress as kind of halting after childhood, Jung was more on the line that into adulthood is when the most significant advancement occurs. So Dabrowski and Maslow, we see the same thing. Maslow saw no differentiation between humans and animals. And so obviously Dabrowski viewed in the higher. And so he saw things as, instead of accepting things as they really are, but to visualize the higher. He quoted Abraham Lincoln with this essentialist kind of quote: "A multi-level approach to actualization will help free the better angels of our nature from the bonds of our animal ancestry, leading yet another step closer to the realization of authentic human nature." So now I kind of want to get into the family tree of Dabrowski. As we look at things, I don't know if anyone's ever read something like The Perennial Philosophy by Huxley or The Courage to Create by Rollo May. You read these things and you can kind of tell they're cut from the same ideals. They're highly similar and relatable to each other. Things that are idealistic, essentialist, existentialist, humanist, realizing the higher and putting off the lower, hierarchical. One of the things that I explored was, I know that Dabrowski was inspired by Plato and Kierkegaard and these other scholars, but I kind of see a different alternate family tree leading up to Dabrowski that I think complements it, that I haven't seen explored before. So I'm going to be exploring Plato and Neoplatonism and the Great Chain of Being, the Perennial Philosophy, Western esotericism and exoteric religion, Carl Jung, archetypes, and the self. So Plato emphasized the universal essences representing absolute truths that exist everywhere and in every time, and that these individual essences exist within us and determine what we can develop into and become. This analogy of the chariot pulled by two horses, a white horse and a dark horse. The white horse represents the spirited soul, is upright and easily follows orders, seeks virtue and honor, where the dark horse represents desires, is hard to control, and is unpredictable. The task is to control and direct the horses. So Neoplatonism continued on from Plato's thought, but they embraced a certain kind of spiritual exercise called theurgy as a means of developing the soul through a process called gnosis. So these practices and philosophies have proven to be very influential throughout human history and is integrated into the philosophical and theological works of many of the most important Islamic, Christian, and Jewish thinkers. So if you look at the practical philosophy, you can kind of see the Dabrowski roots. Along the same road by which it descended, the soul must retrace its step back to the supreme good by the practice of virtue, which practice has a multi-level element, such as lower civic virtues, progressing to higher purifying virtues. It is not enough to be sinless, there is still a higher attainment. One must become as God, beginning with contemplation and moving through levels of knowledge and practice, as the human begins to transcend his lower nature and move into his higher self. The last stage is reached when in the highest tension and concentration one is able to see God, the foundation of life, the source of being, the origin of all good, the root of the soul. Evolving from Platonic and Neoplatonic thought is the concept of the Great Chain of Being, which really while it was developed by Plato and Aristotle, it really took off in the Middle Ages and reached its full expression in the early modern Neoplatonism, and has had a profound influence on Western religion and philosophy. It describes a religious hierarchical structure of all matter in life, believed to have been decreed by God. The chain starts from God and progresses downward, referred to as the ladder and stairway of nature. So you can kind of see a hierarchy. We have God at the top, angels, humankind, higher animals, lower animals, plants, and rocks. When we look at human beings, under the great chain of being, they stress the importance to understand that human beings possess divine powers such as reason, love, and imagination, and possessing the superior ability to create. But they are in this difficult position of trying to balance their divine and animalistic parts of their nature. Capable of intellectual sin, like angels, and physical sins, such as lust and gluttony, when their animal appetites overrule their divine reason. They became subject to passions and physical sensations, pain, hunger, thirst, sexual desire, just like other animals lower on the chain of being. From this, we have evolved into the perennial philosophy, which views all of the world's traditions as sharing a single universal truth on which foundation all religious knowledge and doctrine has grown. So it views that all of these religions is an interpretation of this universal truth adapted to cater for the social needs and consciousness of the people during a given history. This universal truth has been rediscovered in each dispensation of time by saints, sages, prophets, and philosophers. These include not only the founders of the world's great religions, but also gifted and inspired mystics, theologians, and preachers who have revived already existing religions when they have fallen into empty platitudes and hollow ceremonialism. Also, that if you look at the scriptures of each of the world's religions, it might seem that they oppose each other, but one can discern a common doctrine regarding the ultimate purpose of human life. Typically, this doctrine is posited as mystical insofar as it views the summum bonum, the highest ideal good of human life, as an experiential union with the Supreme Being, which can only be achieved by undertaking a program of physical and mental purification or improvement. Then we have Western esotericism. So to understand it, you see all of the different religions. It has an exoteric and an esoteric element. The esoteric we'll start with the exoteric, is intended for or likely to be understood by the general public, current or popular among the general public, relating to the outside world, external. Then you have the esoteric, which is the inner human spiritual experience, whose expressions and symbols are likely to be understood by only a small number of people. And this, so while esotericism is typically referred to as spirituality, exotericism is more related to organized religion. It's been a difficult subject to define, but the best that I could find is it's a perennialist, hidden inner tradition, encompasses worldviews which seek to embrace an enchanted worldview in the face of increasing de-enchantment, and a category that encompasses all of Western culture's rejected knowledge that is accepted by neither the mainstream scientific establishment nor orthodox religious authorities, because they do not accord with normative conceptions of religion, rationality, and science. So I'm not going to read through all of this, but basically that there's this theme of this process of initiation and advancing into higher levels of knowledge. The practice of concordance, that there is a fundamental unifying principle or root from which all world religions and spiritual practices emerge. And then number 4, esotericists place great emphasis on fundamentally transforming themselves through their practice, for instance, through the spiritual transformation that it alleged to accompany the attainment of gnosis. Visionary experience achieved through various types of trance states would heavily influence the emergence of esoteric movements within the United States in the 1800s, such as the religion of spiritualism. Spiritualism was based on the concept that individuals could communicate with the spirits of the deceased. Many believed in the use of a medium, such as a crystal ball or cedar stones, and or a ceremony which would allow them the ability to connect to beings in other or higher realms. Scientific interest in the claims of spiritualism resulted in the development of the field of psychic research, exerting a strong influence on the early disciplines of psychology and psychiatry. So it's often been referred to that esotericism is the third pillar of Western society, Western culture. in that you have mainstream and organized religion, you have science, you have esotericism. But esotericism has always been at odds with mainstream religion. Mainstream religion views esoteric practice or individuals seeking to communicate with God or beings in other realms as being heretical. And so, on one hand, it's considered, or it's rejected by mainstream, and on the scientific, it's viewed as illogical and irrational. Yet, it still has a profound impact on Western culture. Almost all of the major works in popular culture have roots in esoteric. So, for instance, Star Wars. George Lucas was deeply involved in well, I don't want to say deeply involved, but he did have a profound exposure to the esoteric. And you can see that in his work. C.S. Lewis, Walt Disney, for instance, the Twilight series. So while we tend to discard the esoteric in Western culture, you can't deny that it still has this deeply resonating and impactful influence on our culture. Dabrowski said, "The history of Indian, Egyptian, Greek, and Christian art strongly speaks in favor of the thesis that the highest art is born in a temple and belongs to the domain of the initiated. When, however, it is experienced by the masses, it loses its sacredness, its mystic elevation, its level. Nonetheless, it is a fact that some kinds and some elements of truly great art, for example, religious hymns, stir the latent and dampened personality bonds of the majority of people." So now we're going to move on to Carl Jung. Esoteric ideas pervade the work of many early figures in the psychology and psychiatry fields, most notably Carl Jung. However, with the rise of psychoanalysis and behaviorism in the 20th century, these disciplines distanced themselves from esotericism. And just to kind of give a summary of why I kind of went through that whole family tree, I'm trying to show where, Dabrowski kind of branched off from Plato. This is a different branch, but I believe it still has the same values and the same philosophy that influenced someone like Carl Jung. And as I'm going to show here, Carl Jung's work, I believe, contribute to Dabrowski's view of the personality ideal. So the key ideas of Carl Jung is the principle of opposites, a conflict of polarities existing within the human being, and is the primary motivator of behavior and generator of energy, the collective unconscious. These are universal experiences inherited from previous ancestral generations and are manifested as ancient symbols contained deep within the unconscious mind. Essential human nature. The ultimate and necessary goal of life is the realization of the self, which is rarely achieved. Progressive human nature believes human nature demands that we are always moving towards a more complete level of self-realization. Individualization involves becoming an individual, fulfilling one's capacities, and developing oneself. Must abandon the inauthentic behaviors and values and confront their unconscious, bringing it into conscious awareness. The true self is revealed through this process, and the transcendence can occur. Transcendence is an innate drive towards unity or wholeness in the personality, uniting all opposite aspects within the psyche. So, archetype defined is defined as a fundamental psychic energies. What? Okay. Physic energies representing themselves within the human psyche as powerful symbols and images. They are components of the deeper layer of the psyche, which express themselves in mythic or symbolic imagery, and which portray the developmental process of the individual. The archetype is made of image and emotion. The image presents the meaning of the emotion, and the emotion gives the image its dynamic energy. It is autonomous, usually residing in the unconscious. In order for the archetype to be experienced consciously, it is necessary for the individual to be in an altered state of consciousness, however induced. Until we are prepared to undertake that most essential of all explorations, the difficult but rewarding journey of discovery into our inner universe, we will continue to make choices motivated by the unseen and unrecognized energies and images within us, both constructive and destructive. So what are the archetypes? I'm going to quickly go through these. We have the persona, which is Latin for mask, and represents the mask we wear to make a particular impression on others. It is an artificial personality. Typically, we construct it for safety. It's how we interact in society with others. And the danger of the persona is that it can be mistaken, even by ourselves, for our true nature. So there's great danger in identifying totally with the persona. Then we have the shadow, the part of the unconscious mind, and is mysterious and disagreeable to the conscious mind. It is instinctive and irrational, but not necessarily evil. It is made up of the reprehensible characteristics that each of us wish to deny, such as animal tendencies. Shadow is the source of all that is best and worst of human beings. Understanding one's shadow helps one progress towards self-realization. When ignored, it will display a compensatory demonic dynamism. The anima and animus. It personifies the soul or inner attitude, takes on the characteristic of the opposite sex, anima in males, animus in females. Gender roles are societally, not biologically determined. Jung believed humans were essentially bisexual in that we both have masculine and feminine aspects to our nature. So the anima is the feminine side of a male's unconscious mind, and is identified as the unconscious feminine psychological qualities that a male possesses. Animus is more complex than the anima, the most significant autonomous complex, and it manifests itself in dreams and influences how men interact with women. I like this, that confronting the shadow is the apprentice piece, while confronting the anima is the masterpiece. The masterpiece concludes with a phrase Jung termed Sophia, or wisdom, a Gnostic or occult reference. The animus is the masculine side of a woman's personal unconscious, identified as the masculine psychological qualities that a woman possesses, considered to be the natural and primitive part of mind's activity. It tends to be logical, though it can often be argumentative. Then we have the Great Mother, personification of the divine feminine represented by the fertile womb out of which all life comes, and the darkness of the grave to which it returns. It corresponds to the unconscious, the body, and nourishes and supports the ego. The positive creative aspects of the Great Mother are represented by breast and womb. Night, moon, and circles, darkness, and the heart are symbols of the Great Mother. Her attributes are mercy, openness, perceptiveness, intuition, and emotion. Mother is the source of life and nurture, and the images are nearly inexhaustible. Anything hollow, concave, or curved that contains, such as bodies of water, the earth itself, caves, dwellings, and vessels of all kinds. Then we have the Great Father. As the Great Mother pertains to nature, matter, and earth, the Great Father pertains to the realm of light and spirit, the personification of the masculine principle of consciousness symbolized by the upper solar region of heaven. The sun and rain represent the Father as fertilizing forces which impregnate the receptive earth. Also, images of penetrating and piercing with a straight arrow or a sword pertain to the great spiritual Father. Images involving flight, light, or illumination as opposed to the dark earthiness of the Great Mother. Together, the anima and animus form a divine pair known as syzygy. In astronomy, syzygy is when the sun and moon align perfectly in opposition to one another. Jung observed the divine pair to occupy the highest place in Christianity as Christ and his bride Zion. In Hinduism, almost all major forms of God are divine pairs. The self. This is the most important archetype. It's the midpoint unity of personality, a mediating center between consciousness and unconsciousness. Signifies harmony and balance between the various opposing qualities and energies existing within the human soul or psyche. Symbols of the self are usually expressed as geometrical figures such as a mandala, a circle and square. Prominent human figures which represent the self are the Buddha or Christ. Just recently I attended a Neoplatonic academic conference at the University of Seattle, and I met a man there, Dr. Bruce McLennan. He's the department chair of the computer science department at the University of Tennessee, and he's conducting research on archetypes and levels of happiness in humans. He's finding a strong correlation in higher levels of happiness and well-being in those that pattern their lives after the archetypes. So now we'll get into the Jungian personality functions. Just curious, how many people in here are aware of what their MBTI? Okay. Just curious, how many sensors do we have? Would you guys raise your hand? How many intuitives? Okay. Thinkers? Feelers? Judgers? Perceivers? Incredible. So I'm seeing an overwhelming majority of intuitives and perceivers, which, it kind of corresponds to some of my theories of, that certain, do we have any ENTPs or INTPs? All right, I'm an ENTP, so ENTP? INTP?
J.
INTJ? What about INFJ? Any INFJs? Okay. You? Oh.
For me, every time I do that thing, the thinking feeling comes out 50-50.
Oh, okay.
I think I feel, or I feel I think. Something
Okay. Okay. So one of the things that I would love to stress, because it bothers me that the Jungian functions are so misunderstood, is that each person has a sphere or polarity for each function, but the personality type is determined by preference. So, for example, a person can have a deep polarity for feeling, but can prefer thinking when making decisions. Also, they may prefer to spend 70% of their time around people, but 30% of the time they want to be alone. It is incorrect to say, I am an introvert. It would be more correct to say, I prefer introversion. So, in my experience, I observed the gifted to have the following traits: display a deep polarity in opposing functions, have a strong intuitive component, and a strong thinking-feeling dynamic, are sensitive to spirituality and a strong moral component, with above-average intelligence, not necessarily genius, but just, intelligent. Some of the most gifted people I've come across, and in my consulting work that I do in human resources, I've gotten pretty good at being able to identify certain personality types just almost by looking at them. And so, you notice thinkers tend to kind of put their finger on their, kind of talk like this, have more of a nasally voice, like according to my calculations, Whereas feelers are more like breathy, like, they put their hand on their heart, they so basically where I'm going with this is, the more gifted the individual, the harder it is for me to figure out what type they are, because there's such a strong polarity. They might have a very strong thinking and feeling polarity. And typically individuals that have such a deep polarity experience more conflicts. And so in understanding how this relates to Dabrowski, I think this kind of gives a different perspective. My research shows that personalities are naturally attracted to those that have opposite Jungian functions. Extroverts tend to be attracted to introverts, thinkers to feelers, etc. Those who marry others with similar personality traits experience more friction and tension. We inherently and intuitively seek after those who will complete us. So now we're getting into brain hemispheres. So this is kind of my own thing, all right? We have the Adam archetype, represents the divine masculine who was most like unto the great divine father. He was introverted, preferred to work alone, content to stay inside the safety of the Garden of Eden. Sensing, by the book, exact, motivated by the security of the letter of the law. Thinking, logical and practical in his approach. Judging, satisfied by working in the garden and staying busy. He was action-oriented. You have Eve, represents the divine feminine, most like unto the great divine mother. Extroverted, desires to connect with all living, constantly looking outside of the garden. Intuition, seeking to understand the spirit of the law, the mysteries. Feeling, is led by her heart, even if it seems illogical. Perceiving, question-oriented, seeks to know why, desires knowledge. The left brain hemisphere is the male hemisphere. Views things in straight lines, linear, rational, practical, logical, symbolized by the sacred geometrical square or cube, associated with consciousness and boundaries, law, order, straight paths. Right brain hemisphere is the female hemisphere, views things in curves, non-linear, follows heart, open, non-judgmental, symbolized by the sacred geometrical circle or sphere. Associated with the body, the sub or unconscious mind desires to be boundless. Christ consciousness as the self. What was the personality of Jesus? Christ spent his time among people teaching and serving, yet he also spent much time alone in solitude. He honored his sensing power and obeyed the letter of the divine law perfectly while exercising his intuitive power by knowing where to go and what to do without being told. He also went about breaking the laws of men and bringing forth the laws of God. He used his powers of reason and logic when dealing with those who challenged him, but he also showed a tender disposition towards all, especially women and children. He used his power of judgment and was perfectly just in his dealings with others, yet he exercised the power of perception to know the intents and thoughts of the hearts of those around him. Christ is the perfect symbol of his divine parents, the human exemplar of the self, or the personality ideal. In sacred geometry, Christ consciousness is symbolized by the unification of the circle and square. It explains who we were, who we are now, and what we have the potential to become. What manner of man are ye to be? Even as I am. Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect. So, for practical application, if we consider that we all inherited divine personality traits, male and female personality traits from our first parents, and neither is greater or weaker. One must become aware of their personality preferences and structure their life to be authentic to those preferences. So, for instance, as an ENTP, I am driven and motivated by a variation in experience. So I've developed several different avenues of my career which I can exercise when need be. My brother, who is an ESTJ, he values security, predictability, and order. And so my personality isn't greater than his. But if I was put in a position where I had to make detail-oriented judgments all day, that would be operating outside of my personality preferences. So I'm developing a life that is ideal to me and unique to me. But at the same time, to further advance and develop, one must become aware of both sides of their personality and develop those functions outside their preferences. The goal is to learn to utilize the powers and energies from both brain hemispheres in their appropriate times and settings. Dabrowski on the ideal personality. The ideal of personality, conceived schematically, should embrace the fundamental positive qualities of man, not only those that are universal, but also those appearing less often, such as open-mindedness or perceiving, the highest possible sensitivity to human affairs, feeling, the faculty for conscious and effective working upon oneself along the direction accepted as one's own, intuition. The ideal, these are things I added. The ideal of personality may in the most general way be formulated as follows. Personality is the synthesis of the most essential human values embodied in an individual. Divine essence and law. So if I'm looking at divine essence of what we are, I look at the first chapter of Genesis, and God said, let us make man in our own image, after our likeness. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male, and female he created them. First divine law given was, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. Divine laws enable one to receive a fullness of joy within their dimension or sphere. Procreation within the sacred marriage enables one to begin to know the joy that God enjoys. Spirit and matter, inseparably connected, receive a fullness of joy. When separated, man cannot receive a fullness of joy. Just a personal experience, and this is something I could not have experienced. Someone could not explain it to me until it happened. But when I see my son choose light over dark, see him reach out to help someone else, when I see him put his appetites secondary to something greater, when I observe aspects of myself and my wife come out in him, yet see his unique personality, the level of joy that I experience, it is something that I have yet to see and surpass, and I don't know if I will ever see it. And I expect it will only get better as we get older. It might be a little more challenging in some ways, but I suspect that I still am in for a great treat of life. And this is experienced as a creative joy, that I am helping shape a life. I guess my role as a parent is I want to enable him to become himself, but help teach him the light. Marriage, Dabrowski said, marriage based on qualities of a personality union is in which the sexual drive is subordinated to higher feelings and permits the couple to assume a correct attitude about the question of procreation. The sexual drive becomes therefore not a blind force, but a dynamism controlled by sets of subliminating tendencies. The attitude of concern, responsibility, devotion to, and esteem for the future human being probably contributes also to the child inheriting the positive qualities of the parents and is certainly decisive in regard to his proper education. One of the essential qualities in the structure of personality is an attachment on the part of humans, and especially children, to the worthy points of tradition, family, region, and nation, and attachment to parents and siblings to worthy principles and habits prevailing at home. Such attachment plays a great role in deepening the feelings and in developing the sense of moral duty. Besides, it is a foundation on which grow values of lasting character, and the attachment permits the person in relations with people and in dealing with problems to distinguish between lasting things and those of fluid, temporary nature. Speaking about bonds, Dabrowski said another basic individual quality that he represented in exemplars of personality development are the lasting emotional bonds of love and friendship, bonds symbolized by the Platonic myth of two halves of the same soul. The best example of such conjunction are the bonds between Christ and his apostles, which lead to the highest degree of friendship. Skipping down, or by the brotherhood often entered into in religious orders, which kind of goes back to that esoteric reference by Dabrowski. In common life, we encounter such individual or group unions of a higher order of spiritual tension in the love between married people who go side by side, desiring the realization of a common idea. He talks about absolutes, and this is kind of where we talk about divine laws and the absoluteness. We endeavor to base our conception on standards and on human values of a lasting character, or values accepted and realized by man since the very beginning of his culture, on values regarded as absolute. They have found their expression throughout the history of mankind, coming together in varying degrees in known historical personalities. Man's instinct for development, which in the broadest meaning of the word, is a tendency to mental and moral perfection, sooner or later gains power and reinvigorates and enhances the positive values. These values, sustained, consolidated, and developed by tradition, legal order, and moral and customary standards, may undergo jolts and perturbations, may be driven back to the level of potentiality, but can never be eradicated. Even in periods of collapse, they survive us in the form of moral readiness and yearning for their revival and full realization, as they can constitute the foundation and prerequisite of the cultural and moral existence of humanity. These values are indestructible. They have existed from the very beginning of man's history and are unchangeable in their essence, though revealing various degrees of development and richness. The lasting positive values of man may be classified into universal and particular, the latter occurring less frequently. The universal positive values that dominate societies of different ethics and cultures sometimes form a general positive characteristic of these societies. Decisive in this area is the frequency with which they appear. Such positive universal qualities include, for example, religiosity, the sense of individual and social responsibility, training in citizens' duties, fidelity to principles and people, a sense of justice, courage, honesty, and discipline. These particular qualities, or groups of some of them, appear relatively often among human beings. So, the questions that I have: what common themes do we find in human symbols of religion and spirituality? What would an advanced idealistic society, government, religion, and culture look like? Is committed marriage and procreation a requirement for those desiring advanced development? What new perspectives can spirituality give us in helping advance the knowledge of the human mind and consciousness? What types of research can be done to unite the worlds of religion and science? The aims of my work, which is a work in progress, and as Dabrowski has said multiple times, the work on on coming to understand the ideal personality, personality development, cannot be done in one book. It can't be done in one PowerPoint presentation. It can't be done in one speech. This is a work in progress to evaluate human advancement and potential idealistically by furthering a unique spiritual perspective to the theory of positive disintegration. Evaluate human opposites in the divine male-female essence of development and becoming the self. Answering the question, are marriage, procreation, and family the way to a fullness of joy? Can this be measured? Bring all forms of consciousness together with an emphasis on the spiritual, unifying science and religion, bringing measurable to the unmeasurable. Seek to understand the laws of advancement with an emphasis on divine laws. Finally, in conclusion, Dabrowski said on Measuring the Unmeasurable, "Here is surely the heart of the matter, that sin is sin because it is personally and socially destructive, and this is something that can be empirically studied and verified and is not dependent upon myth or revelation. The fact that scientists, with their empiricism, do not now hold themselves above considering moral problems, and that at least some ministers, with their moral concern, are willing to look at these matters pragmatically, are developments which one can only welcome. And they point, at least tentatively, to the possibility of an era in which the present conflict between science and religion will be harmoniously and creatively resolved." Thank you. Okay. Questions? Did you have a question?
Are you talking to me?
Yeah, you said we'd group
Well,
the idealism.
I'd like you to articulate how the laws are necessary for the growth. Going back to that first slide, earlier slide. And I'd like you to kind of articulate how autonomy jives with what we're talking about.
So if you look at autonomy, what is autonomy defined as? Autonomy is defined as self-governing. And so if you look at autonomy and you look at this idealism, this, I think, really marries this two concept of being governed by these laws that enable this freedom, that enable this idealistic union between the possibilities and limitations. So because of the limitations, the human limitations, whether that be the limitations of the human body, the limitations of the spirit, the limitations of consciousness, the limitations that we each individual experience as different levels of intelligence, that understanding these limitations in combined with seeking towards the ideal and honoring these divine laws help you to reach past the mark. I don't know if anyone's ever read this book, The Courage to Create. Has anyone read this? Rollo May. She actually talks about that, the tension between the value of limits. Consciousness itself is born out of the awareness of these limits. Human consciousness is the distinguishing feature of our existence. Without limitations, we never would have developed it. Consciousness is the awareness that emerges out of the dialectical tension between possibilities and limitations. She goes on to say that he goes on to say that that saying the sky is the limit or there are no limits is very de-energizing to the human soul.
Take that a step forward. So without limits, we would...
So comparing it to taking water, okay? If we had just on the table, if I took water and just poured it out, it would fall down the table. Whereas if I created kind of like a vessel, it would evenly flow and pour. So it's kind of this synergizing effect between, because of the limits, it has that energy to move forward in a direction. Does that make sense? What do you think, James?
No, I agree.
So yeah. Any other questions?
Why would procreation be required for advanced development?
So procreation to me is something. Do you have kids or?
I've never wanted children.
Okay, so this is the sort of thing that I was the same
Not
way.
on my own anyway. I love other people.
So I didn't have my first son until my late 20s, and I was kind of the same way. I mean, I thought I might want kids later, but I guess it's something that really I cannot logically fully answer. I mean, I can try, but it wasn't until I experienced it and I held him for myself that it really just kind of intuitively connected within me. That really is the most fullest answer I could give you, but I could try to give you a logical answer, but I don't know if...
But it's within God's plan.
What's that?
It's within God's plan.
Right, the first divine law of multiply and replenish the earth.
To submit the earth to one's power.
Right.
But that's Genesis.
So this is one of my,
Jesus.
I guess one of my works is for people who, because especially among my generation, the millennial generation, there is this growing sentiment, kind of anti-family, and I guess my message is there needs to be another look at the role that procreation and family have on the human experience. Is this the ultimate human? Are we missing out of our privilege as being a human by choosing not to have children? Because again, I mean, respecting one's agency, and obviously not everyone are able to have children. Some people aren't able to be married, you know. I guess what I'm saying is, if you are able, at least to give one more perspective or another perspective from someone who has experienced it.
Can I ask one more question? How do you reconcile discussing, on one hand, what seems to be a traditional religious approach and esotericism at the same time?
Right.
What's that? So,
Right.
say that first part again.
Okay, so on one hand, part of your presentation seems to emphasize a traditional religious tradition. On the other hand, the middle part of your presentation emphasized Jung's esotericism and white magic. How do you reconcile white magic with traditional religion?
That is a really good question. I wasn't going to get into it, but okay.
Did you have an answer?
Okay,
You have an answer.
I do have an answer.
Okay.
As I studied myself and my religious upbringing and this, like what I talked about with the Holy Ghost, right? I was raised in a Mormon family, and Mormonism is an American religion. And I became very curious about of American religion. And so, for instance, in my practice, so when I had left, and stepped away from everything, and that included leaving the Mormon Church. As I contemplated my life after the birth of my child, and because for a while there I was really sad of, how much did I miss out on, by living the Mormon life. I could have had sex with so many girls, that I didn't. I could have, done so many drugs. I could have, here I am in this house, probably because it's all my religion told me to do it. And as I contemplated these divine laws and the emphasis on this organized religion and the way that the impact that had on my life, I saw that it was needful. And as I read more of Dabrowski, he values organized religion for the confessionary experience and the opportunity we have to go out and serve. So what's interesting, to get to your main question, Mormonism actually is an esoteric religion, but an organized religion. What's interesting in one of my works is, and I lament this, that modern-day Mormonism has strayed far from its original esoteric. Mormons don't know what esotericism is, but Joseph Smith, the founder, actually translated this book. He claims by viewing into a pair of seer stones, and he channeled it, right?
Right.
And again, it's got this very esoteric, but this Dabrowskian kind of feel to it, like.
But it's also a very prescriptive text.
What do you mean?
It tells you what to do.
What, the Book of Mormon?
Yeah.
In what way?
Well, you're talking about absolute laws.
Mm-hmm.
You want to attain the end and change it, you've got to do what you have to do.
Right.
Right? You have to fulfill the commandments of the Mormon faith in order to get into the temple. This is common of all esoteric societies, right? To be initiated into these temples of higher learning, there's certain fulfillments you have to do. And so, really, again, that's another thing I look at. As I looked at kind of the premises of a lot of what Mormonism is, it's higher values and virtues. If you think about what Mormons are known for, they're known for their families, for their morality. Is there individual autonomy in Mormonism?
What's that?
Is there individual autonomy in Mormonism?
I would say so. Now, I think that this is kind of what goes into that possibilities and limitations. That to me, if I were to describe my spiritual and religious life, I have an esoteric and spiritual perspective that is independent from Mormonism. But I also value my roots in the organized religion, and I see its role. And I also, one of the things, if you actually kind of view the common themes of the Book of Mormon, is this opposites, right? One of the scriptures, there must needs be opposition in all things, otherwise righteousness could not be brought to pass. Justice exercises his demands, and mercy claims all which is her own. Can mercy rob justice? This whole, the natural man is an enemy to God, and unless a man puts off the natural man, he will not advance. I think one of the things that, to answer your question is to be able to marry the two, esoteric spirituality and exoteric religion. That's a very, very interesting and unique perspective.
It's a big leap.
What's that?
It's a big leap.
Big leap. And so to understand that an American religion has actually founded that there's that exists in the world, but not very many people really understand what that is and what that means. It's one of those things, kind of my level 5, what I seek to do is to hopefully awaken and restore to a lot of Mormons an understanding of their esoteric and spiritual roots, get away from the dogmas, get away from the rigid religious lifestyle while still maintaining the morals. I'm not saying don't devalue, but that it's time to explore the spiritual, and it's time to understand the roots. So,
thank you for your answer.
Yeah, you're welcome.
We're well over time. Thanks so much for coming.